Murder by Arnold Bennett. Two men named respectively Lomax Harder and John Frantin were walking side by side one autumn afternoon on the marine parade of the seaside resort and port of Quongate, English Channel. Both were well dressed and had the air of moderate wealth, and both were about 35 years of age. At this point, the resemblances between them ceased. Lomax Harder had refined features, an enormous forehead, fair hair, and a delicate, almost apologetic manner. John Frantin was low-browed, heavy-chinned, scowling, defiant, indeed, what is called a tough customer. Lomax Harder corresponded in appearance with the popular notion of a poet, save that he was carefully barbered. He was, in fact, a poet, and not unknown in the tiny, trifling, mad world where poetry is a matter of first-rate interest. John Frantin corresponded in appearance with the popular notion of a gambler, an amateur boxer, and, in spare time, a deluder of women. Popular notions sometimes fit the truth. Lomax Harder, somewhat nervously buttoning his overcoat, said in a quiet but firm and insistent tone, "Haven't you got anything to say?" John Frantin stopped suddenly in front of a shop whose facade bore the sign, "Gontle, Gunsmith." "Not in words," answered Frantin. "I'm going in here." And he brusquely entered the small, shabby shop. Lomax Harder hesitated half a second and then followed his companion. The shopman was a middle-aged gentleman wearing a black velvet cloak. "Good afternoon," he greeted Frantin, with an expression and in a tone of urbane condescension, which seemed to indicate that Frantin was a wise as well as a fortunate man in that he knew of the excellence of Gontles and had the wit to come into Gontles. The name of Gontle was favourably and respectfully known wherever triggers are pressed. Not only along the whole length of the Channel coast, but throughout England was Gontles renowned. Sportsmen would travel to Quongate from the far north or even from London to buy guns. To say, "I bought it at Gontles," or "Old Gontle recommended it," was sufficient to silence any dispute concerning the merits of a firearm. Experts bowed the head before the unique reputation of Gontle. As for old Gontle, he was extremely and pardonably conceited. His conviction that no other gunsmith in the wide world could compare with him was absolute. He sold guns and rifles with the gesture of a monarch conferring an honour. He never argued, he stated, and the customer who contradicted him was as likely as not to be courteously and icily informed by Gontle of the geographical situation of the shop door. Such shops exist in the English provinces, and nobody knows how they have achieved their renown. They could exist nowhere else. "Afternoon," said Frantin gruffly, and paused. "What can I do for you?" asked Mr. Gontle, as if saying, "Now don't be afraid. This shop is tremendous, and I am tremendous, but I shall not eat you." "I want a revolver," Frantin snapped. "Ah, a revolver," commented Mr. Gontle, as if saying, "A gun or a rifle, yes, but a revolver, an arm without individuality, manufactured wholesale. However, I suppose I must deign to accommodate you." "I presume you know something about revolvers?" asked Mr. Gontle, as he began to produce the weapons. "A little." "Do you know the Webley Mark III?" "Can't say that I do." It is the best for all common purposes." And Mr. Gontle's glance said, "Have the goodness not to tell me it isn't." Frantin examined the Webley Mark III. "You see," said Mr. Gontle, "the point about it is that until the breech is properly closed, it cannot be fired, so that it can't blow open and maim or kill the would-be murderer." Mr. Gontle smiled archly at one of his oldest jokes. "What about suicides?" Frantin grimly demanded. "You might show me just how to load it," said Frantin. Mr. Gontle, having found ammunition, complied with this reasonable request. "The barrel's a bit scratched," said Frantin. Mr. Gontle inspected the scratch with pain. He would have denied the scratch, but could not. "Here's another one," said he, "since you are so particular." He simply had to put customers in their place. "You might load it," said Frantin. Mr. Gontle loaded the second revolver. "I'd like to try it," said Frantin. "Certainly," said Mr. Gontle, and led Frantin out of the shop by the back and down to a cellar where revolvers could be experimented with. Lomax Harder was now alone in the shop. He hesitated a long time and then picked up the revolver rejected by Frantin, fingered it, put it down, and picked it up again. The back door of the shop opened suddenly, and, startled, Harder dropped the revolver into his overcoat pocket, a thoughtless, quite unpremeditated act. He dared not remove the revolver. The revolver was as fast in his pocket as though the pocket had been sewn up. "And cartridges?" asked Mr. Gontle of Frantin. "Oh," said Frantin, "I've only had one shot. 5 will be more than enough for the present. What does it weigh?" "Let me see. 4-inch barrel? Yes. 1 pound 4 ounces. Frantin paid for the revolver, received 13 shillings in change from a £5 note, and strode out of the shop, weapon in hand. He was gone before Lomax Harder decided upon a course of action. "And for you, sir," said Mr. Gontle, addressing the poet. Harder suddenly comprehended that Mr. Gontle had mistaken him for a separate customer, who had happened to enter the shop a moment after the first one. Harder and Frantin had said not a word to one another during the purchase, and Harder well knew that in the most exclusive shops it is the custom utterly to ignore a second customer until the first one has been dealt with. "I want to see some foils," Harder spoke stammeringly, the only words that came into his head. "Foils?" exclaimed Mr. Gontle, shocked, as if to say, "Is it conceivable that you should imagine that I, Gontle, gunsmith, sell such things as foils?" After a little talk, Harder apologized and departed. A thief. "I'll call later and pay the fellow," said Harder to his restive conscience. "No, I can't do that. I'll send him some anonymous postal orders." He crossed the parade and saw Frantin, a small left-handed figure, all alone, far below on the deserted sands, pointing the revolver. He thought that his ear caught the sound of a discharge, but the distance was too great for him to be sure. He continued to watch, and at length Frantin walked westward, diagonally across the beach. "He's going back to the Bellevue," thought Harder, the Bellevue being the hotel from which he had met Frantin coming out half an hour earlier. He strolled slowly towards the White Hotel, but Frantin, who had evidently come up the face of the cliff in the penny lift, was before him. Harder, standing outside, saw Frantin seated in the lounge. Then Frantin rose and vanished down the long passage at the rear of the lounge. Harder entered the hotel rather guiltily. There was no hall porter at the door, and not a soul in the lounge or in sight of the lounge. Harder went down the long passage. At the end of the passage, Lomax Harder found himself in a billiard room, an apartment built partly of brick and partly of wood, on a sort of courtyard behind the main structure of the hotel. The roof, of iron and grimy glass, rose to a point in the middle. On 2 sides, the high walls of the hotel obscured the light. Dusk was already closing in. A small fire burned feebly in the grate. A large radiator under the window was steel cold, for though summer was finished, winter had not officially begun in the small, economically run hotel, so that the room was chilly. Nevertheless, in deference to the English passion for fresh air and discomfort, the window was wide open. Frantin, in his overcoat and an unlit cigarette between his lips, stood lowering with his back to the bit of fire. At sight of Harder, he lifted his chin in a dangerous challenge. "So, you're still following me about," he said resentfully to Harder. "Yes," said the latter, with his curious, gentle primness of manner. "I came down here specially to talk to you. I should have said all I had to say earlier, only you happened to be going out of the hotel just as I was coming in. You didn't seem to want to talk in the street. But there's some talking has to be done. I've a few things I must tell you. Harder appeared to be perfectly calm, and he felt perfectly calm. He advanced from the door towards the billiard table. Frantin raised his hand, displaying his square-ended, brutal fingers in the twilight. Now, listen to me, he said, with cold, measured ferocity. You can't tell me anything I don't know. If there's some talking to be done, I'll do it myself, and when I've finished, you can get out. I know that my wife has taken a ticket for Copenhagen by the steamer from Harwich, and that she's been seeing to her passport and packing. And of course, I know that you have interests in Copenhagen and spend about half your precious time there. I'm not worrying to connect the two things. All that's got nothing to do with me. Emily has always seen a great deal of you, and I know that the last week or two she's been seeing you more than ever. Not that I mind that. I know that she objects to my treatment of her and my conduct generally. That's all right. But it's a matter that only concerns her and me. I mean, it's no concern of yours, for instance, or anybody else's. If she objects enough, she can try and divorce me. I doubt if she'd succeed, but you never can be sure with these new laws. Anyhow, she's my wife till she does divorce me, and so she has the usual duties and responsibilities towards me, even though I was the worst husband in the world. It's how I look at it in my old-fashioned way. I've just had a letter from her. She knew I was here, and I expect that explains how you knew I was here. It does, said Lomax Harder quietly. Frantin pulled a letter out of his inner pocket and unfolded it. Yes, he said, glancing at it, and read some sentences aloud. I have absolutely decided to leave you, and I won't hide from you that I know you know who is doing what he can to help me. I can't live with you any longer. You may be very fond of me, as you say, but I find your way of showing your fondness too humiliating and painful. I've said this to you before, and now I'm saying it for the last time, and so on and so on. Frantin tore the letter in two, dropped one half on the floor, twisted the other half into a spill, turned to the fire, and lit his cigarette. That's what I think of her letter, he proceeded, the cigarette between his teeth. You're helping her, are you? Very well. I don't say you're in love with her or she with you. I'll make no wild statements. But if you aren't in love with her, I wonder why you're taking all this trouble over her. Do you go about the world helping ladies who say they're unhappy just for the pure sake of helping? Never mind. Emily isn't going to leave me. Get that into your head. I shan't let her leave me. She has money and I haven't. I've been living on her, and it would be infernally awkward for me if she left me for good. That's a reason for keeping her, isn't it? But you may believe me or not. It isn't my reason. She's right enough when she says I'm very fond of her. That's reason for keeping her too. But it isn't my reason. My reason is that a wife's a wife, and she can't break her word just because everything isn't lovely in the garden. I've heard it said I'm unmoral. I'm not all unmoral, and I feel particularly strongly about what's called the marriage tie. He drew the revolver from his overcoat pocket and held it up to view. You see this thing? You saw me buy it. Now, you needn't be afraid. I'm not threatening you, and it's no part of my game to shoot you. I've nothing to do with your goings-on. What I have to do with is the goings-on of my wife. If she deserts me, for you or for anybody or for nobody, I shall follow her, whether it's to Copenhagen or Bangkok or the North Pole, and I shall kill her with just this very revolver that you saw me buy. And now you can get out. Frantin replaced the revolver and began to consume the cigarette with fierce and large puffs. Lomax Harder looked at the grim, set, brutal, scowling, bitter face, and knew that Frantin meant what he'd said. Nothing would stop him from carrying out his threat. The fellow was not an argufier. He could not reason, but he had unmistakable grit and would never recoil from the fear of consequences. If Emily left him, Emily was a dead woman. Nothing in the end could protect her from the execution of her husband's menace. On the other hand, nothing would persuade her to remain with her husband. She had decided to go, and she would go. And indeed, the mere thought of this lady to whom he, Harder, was utterly devoted, staying with her husband and continuing to suffer the tortures and humiliations which she had been suffering for years, the thought revolted him. He could not think it. He stepped forward along the side of the billiard table, and simultaneously Frantin stepped forward to meet him. Lomax Harder snatched the revolver which was in his pocket, aimed, and pulled the trigger. Frantin collapsed, with the upper half of his body somehow balanced on the edge of the billiard table. He was dead. The sound of the report echoed in Harder's ear like the sound of a violin string loudly twanged by a finger. He saw a little reddish hole in Frantin's bronzed right temple. Well, he thought, somebody had to die, and it's better him than Emily. He felt that he had performed a righteous act. Also, he felt a little sorry for Frantin. Then he was afraid. He was afraid for himself, because he wanted not to die, especially on the scaffold, but also for Emily Frantin, who would be friendless and helpless without him. He couldn't bear to think of her alone in the world, the central point of a terrific scandal. He must get away instantly. Not down the corridor, back into the hotel lounge. No, that would be fatal. The window. He glanced at the corpse. It was more odd, curious than affrighting. He had made the corpse. Strange. He could not unmake it. He had accomplished the irrevocable. Impressive. He saw Frantin's cigarette glowing on the linoleum in the deepening dusk, and picked it up and threw it into the fender. Lace curtains hung across the whole width of the window. He drew one aside and looked forth. The light was much stronger in the courtyard than within the room. He put his gloves on. He gave a last look at the corpse, straddled the window-sill, and was on the brick pavement of the courtyard. He saw that the curtain had fallen back into the perpendicular. He gazed around. Nobody. Not a light in any window. He saw a green wooden gate, pushed it, it yielded, then a sort of entry passage. In a moment, after 2 half-turns, he was on the Marine Parade again. He was a fugitive. Should he fly to the right or to the left? Then he had an inspiration. An idea of genius for baffling pursuers. He would go into the hotel by the main entrance. He went slowly and deliberately into the portico, where a middle-aged porter was standing in the gloom. "Good evening, sir." "Good evening. Have you got any rooms?" "I think so, sir. The housekeeper's out, but she'll be back in a moment, if you'd like a seat. The manager's away in London." The hall porter suddenly illuminated the lounge, and Lomax Harder, blinking, entered and sat down. "I might have a cocktail while I'm waiting," the murderer suggested, with a bright and friendly smile. "A Bronx." "Certainly, sir. The page is off duty. He sees to orders in the lounge, but I'll attend to you myself." What a hotel, thought the murderer, solitary in the chilly lounge, and gave a glance down the long passage. Is the whole place run by the hall porter? But of course, it's the dead season. Was it conceivable that nobody had heard the sound of the shot? Harder had a strong impulse to run away, but no, to do so would be highly dangerous. He restrained himself. "How much?" he asked of the hall porter, who had arrived with surprising quickness, tray in hand and glass on tray. "A shilling, sir." The murderer gave him 18 pence and drank off the cocktail. "I thank you very much, sir." The hall porter took the glass. "See here," said the murderer. "I'll look in again. I've got one or two little errands to do." And he went slowly into the obscurity of the Marine Parade. Lomax Harder leant over the left arm of the sea wall of the man-made port of Quongate. Not another soul was there. Night had fallen. The lighthouse at the extremity of the right arm was occulting. The lights, some red, some green, many white, of ships at sea, passed in both directions in endless processions. Waves plashed gently against the vast masonry of the wall. The wind, blowing steadily from the northwest, was not cold. Harder, looking about, though he knew he was absolutely alone, took his revolver from his overcoat pocket and stealthily dropped it into the sea. Then he turned round and gazed across the small harbour at the mysterious amphitheatre of the lighted town, and heard public clocks and religious clocks striking the hour. He was a murderer. But why should he not successfully escape detection? Other murderers had done so. He had all his wits. He was not excited. He was not morbid. His perspective of things was not askew. The hall porter had not seen his first entrance into the hall, nor his exit after the crime. Nobody had seen them. He had left nothing behind in the billiard room, no finger marks on the window-sill. The putting on of his gloves was in itself a clear demonstration that he had fully kept his presence of mind. No footmarks on the hard, dry pavement of the courtyard. Of course, there was the possibility that some person unseen had seen him getting out of the window. Slight, but still a possibility. And there was also the possibility that someone who knew Frantin by sight had noted him walking by Frantin's side in the streets. If such a person informed the police and gave a description of him, inquiries might be made. No, nothing in it. His appearance offered nothing remarkable to the eye of a casual observer, except his forehead, of which he was rather proud, but which was hidden by his hat. It was generally believed that criminals always did something silly, but so far he had done nothing silly, and he was convinced that in regard to the crime, he never would do anything silly. He had none of the desire supposed to be common among murderers to revisit the scene of the crime, or to look upon the corpse once more. Although he regretted the necessity for his act, he felt no slightest twinge of conscience. Somebody had to die, and surely it was better that a brute should die than the heavenly, enchanting, martyrized creature whom his act had rescued forever from the brute. He was aware within himself of an ecstasy of devotion to Emily Frantin, now a widow, and free. She was a unique woman. Strange that a woman of such gifts should have come under the sway of so obvious a scoundrel as Frantin, but she was very young at the time, and such freaks of sex had happened before and would happen again. They were a widespread phenomenon in the history of the relations of men and women. He would have killed 100 men if 100 men had threatened her felicity. His heart was pure. He wanted nothing from Emily in exchange for what he had done in her defence. He was passionate in her defence. When he reflected upon the coarseness and cruelty of the gesture by which Frantin had used Emily's letter to light his cigarette, Harder's cheeks grew hot with burning resentment. A clock struck the quarter. Harder walked quickly to the harbour front, where was a taxi rank, and drove to the station. A sudden apprehension. The crime might have been discovered. Police might already be watching for suspicious-looking travellers. Absurd. Still, the apprehension remained, despite its absurdity. The taxi driver looked at him queerly. No, imagination. He hesitated on the threshold of the station, then walked boldly in and showed his return ticket to the ticket inspector. No sign of a policeman. He got into the Pullman car where 5 other passengers were sitting. The train started. He nearly missed the boat train at Liverpool station because, according to its custom, the Quongate flyer arrived 20 minutes late at Victoria. And at Victoria, the foolish part of him, as distinguished from the common sense part, suffered another spasm of fear. Would detectives, instructed by telegraph, be waiting for the train? No! An absurd idea. The boat train from Liverpool station was crowded with travellers, and the platform crowded with senders off. He gathered from scraps of talk overheard that an international conference was about to take place at Copenhagen, and he had known nothing of it, not seen a word of it in the papers. Excusable, perhaps, graver matters had held his attention. Useless to look for Emily in the vast bustle of the compartments. She had her through ticket, which she had taken herself in order to avoid possible complications, and she happened to be the only woman in the world who was never late and never in a hurry. She was certain to be in the train, but was she in the train? Something sinister might have come to pass. For instance, a telephone message in the flat that her husband had been found dead with a bullet in his brain. The swift 2-hour journey to Harwich was terrible for Lomax Harder. He remembered that he had left the unburnt part of the letter lying under the billiard table. Forgetful. Silly. One of the silly things that criminals did. And on Parkston Quay, the confusion was enormous. He didn't walk, he was swept onto the great shaking steamer whose dark funnels rose amid wisps of steam into the starry sky. One advantage, detectives would have no chance in that multitudinous scene unless, indeed, they held up the ship. The ship roared a warning and slid away from the quay, groped down the tortuous channel to the harbour mouth, and was in the North Sea, and England dwindled to naught but a string of lights. He searched every deck from stem to stern, and could not find Emily. She had not caught the train, or, if she had caught the train, she had not boarded the steamer because he had failed to appear. His misery was intense. Everything was going wrong. And on the arrival at Esbjerg, would not detectives be lying in wait for the Copenhagen train? Then he descried her, and she him. She too had been searching. Only chance had kept them apart. Her joy at finding him was ecstatic. Tears came into his eyes at sight of it. He was everything to her, absolutely everything. He clasped her right hand in both his hands and gazed at her in the dim diffused light, blended of stars, moon, and electricity. No woman was ever like her, mature, innocent, wise, trustful, honest. And the touching beauty of her appealing, sad, happy face, and the pride of her carriage, a unique jewel, snatched from the brutal grasp of that fellow who had ripped her solemn letter in two and used it as a spill for his cigarette. She related her movements and he his. Then she said, "Well, I didn't go," he answered. "Thought it best not to. I'm convinced it wouldn't have been any use." He had not intended to tell her this lie. Yet, when it came to the point, what else could he say? He told one lie instead of 20. He was deceiving her, but for her sake. Even if the worst occurred, she was forever safe from that brutal grasp, and he had saved her. As for the conceivable complications of the future, he refused to front them. He could live in the marvellous present. He felt suddenly the amazing beauty of the night at sea, and beneath all his other sensations was the obscure sensation of a weight at his heart. "I expect you were right," she angelically acquiesced. The superintendent of police, Quongate was the county town of the western half of the county, and a detective sergeant were in the billiard room of the Bellevue. Both wore mufti. The powerful green-shaded lamps usual in billiard rooms shone down ruthlessly on the green table and on the reclining body of John Frantin, which had not moved and had not been moved. A charwoman was just leaving these offices when a stout gentleman, who had successfully beguiled the policeman guarding the other end of the long corridor, squeezed past her, greeted the two officers, and shut the door. The superintendent, a thin man with lips to match and a moustache, stared hard at the arrival. "I'm staying with my friend, Dr. Furnival," said the arrival cheerfully. "You telephoned for him, and as he had to go out to one of those cases in which nature will not wait, I offered to come in his place. I've met you before, Superintendent, at Scotland Yard." "Dr. Austin Bond!" exclaimed the superintendent. "He," said the other. They shook hands, Dr. Bond genially, the superintendent half consequential, half deferential, as one who had his dignity to think about, also as one who resented an intrusion, but dared not show resentment. The detective sergeant recoiled at the dazzling name of the great amateur detective, a genius who had solved the famous mysteries of the Yellow Hat, the Three Towns, the Three Feathers, the Gold Spoon, etc., 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 whose devilish perspicacity had again and again made professional detectives both look and feel foolish, and whose notorious friendship with the loftiest heads of Scotland Yard compelled all police forces to treat him very politely indeed. "Yes," said Dr. Austin Bond, after detailed examination. "Been shot about 90 minutes, poor fellow. Who found him?" "That woman who's just gone out, some servant here, came in to look after the fire." "How long since?" "Oh, about an hour ago." "Found the bullet? I see it hit the brass on that cue rack there." The detective sergeant glanced at the superintendent, who, however, resolutely remained unastonished. "Here's the bullet," said the superintendent. "Ah," commented Dr. Austin Bond, glinting through his spectacles at the bullet as it lay in the superintendent's hand. "Decimal 38, I see. Flattened. It would be." "Sergeant," said the superintendent, "you can get help and have the body moved now Dr. Bond has made his examination. Eh, Doctor?" "Certainly," answered Dr. Bond at the fireplace. "He was smoking a cigarette, I see. Either he or his murderer. You've got a clue?" "Oh, yes," the superintendent answered, not without pride. "Look here. Your torch, Sergeant?" The detective sergeant produced a pocket electric lamp, and the superintendent turned to the window-sill. "I've got a stronger one than that," said Dr. Austin Bond, producing another torch. The superintendent displayed fingerprints on the window frame, footmarks on the sill, and a few strands of inferior blue cloth. Dr. Austin Bond next produced a magnifying glass and inspected the evidence at very short range. "The murderer must have been a tall man. You can judge that from the angle of fire. He wore a blue suit, which he tore slightly on this splintered wood of the window frame. One of his boots had a hole in the middle of the sole, and he'd only 3 fingers on his left hand. He must have come in by the window and gone out by the window, because the hall porter is sure that nobody except the dead man entered the lounge by any door within an hour of the time when the murder must have been committed." The superintendent proudly gave many more details, and ended by saying that he had already given instructions to circulate a description. "Curious," said Dr. Austin Bond, "that a man like John Frantin should let anyone enter the room by the window, especially a shabby-looking man." "You knew the deceased personally, then?" "No, but I know he was John Frantin." "How, Doctor?" "Luck." "Sergeant," said the superintendent, piqued, "tell the constable to fetch the hall porter." Dr. Austin Bond walked to and fro, peering everywhere, and picked up a piece of paper that had lodged against the step of the platform, which ran round 2 sides of the room for the raising of the spectators' benches. He glanced at the paper casually and dropped it again. "My man," the superintendent addressed the hall porter, "how can you be sure that nobody came in here this afternoon?" "Because I was in my cubicle all the time, sir." The hall porter was lying, but he had to think of his own welfare. On the previous day, he had been reprimanded for quitting his post against the rule. Taking advantage of the absence of the manager, he had sinned once again, and he lived in fear of dismissal if found out. With a full view of the lounge? Yes, sir. Might have been in there beforehand, Dr. Austin Bond suggested. No, said the superintendent. The charwoman came in twice. Once just before Frantin came in. She saw the fire wanted making up, and she went for some coal, and then returned later with some coal. But the look of Frantin frightened her, and she went back with her coal. Yes, said the hall porter, I saw that. Another lie. At a sign from the superintendent, he withdrew. I should like to have a word with that charwoman, said Dr. Austin Bond. The superintendent hesitated. Why should the great amateur meddle with what did not concern him? Nobody had asked his help. But the superintendent thought of the amateur's relations with Scotland Yard and sent for the charwoman. Did you clean the window here today? Dr. Austin Bond interrogated her. Yes, please, sir. Show me your left hand. The slattern obeyed. How did you lose your little finger? In a mangle accident, sir. Just come to the window, will you, and put your hands on it, but take off your left boot first. The slattern began to weep. It's quite all right, my good creature, Dr. Austin Bond reassured her. Your skirt is torn at the hem, isn't it? When the slattern was released from her ordeal and had gone, carrying one boot in her grimy hand, Dr. Austin Bond said genially to the superintendent, Just a fluke. I happened to notice she'd only 3 fingers on her left hand when she passed me in the corridor. Sorry I've destroyed your evidence, but I felt sure, almost from the first, that the murderer hadn't either entered or decamped by the window. How? Because I think he's still here in the room. The 2 police officers gazed about them, as if exploring the room for the murderer. I think he's there. Dr. Austin Bond pointed to the corpse. And where did he hide the revolver after he killed himself? Demanded the thin-lipped superintendent icily, when he had somewhat recovered his aplomb. I've thought of that too, said Dr. Austin Bond, beaming. It's always a very wise course to leave a dead body absolutely untouched until a professional man has seen it. But looking at the body can do no harm. You see the left-hand pocket of the overcoat. Notice how it bulges. Something unusual in it. Something that has the shape of a... Just feel inside it, will you? The superintendent, obeying, drew a revolver from the overcoat pocket of the dead man. Ah, yes, said Dr. Austin Bond. A Webley Mark III. Quite new. You might take out the ammunition. The superintendent dismantled the weapon. Yes, 3 chambers empty. Wonder how he used the other 2. Now, where's that bullet? You see, he fired, his arm dropped, and the revolver happened to fall into the pocket. Fired with his left hand, did he? Asked the superintendent, foolishly ironic. Certainly. A dozen years ago, Frantin was perhaps the finest amateur lightweight boxer in England, and one reason for it was that he bewildered his opponents by being left-handed. His lefts were much more fatal than his rights. I saw him box several times. Whereupon Dr. Austin Bond strolled to the step of the platform near the door and picked up the fragment of very thin paper that was lying there. This, said he, must have blown from the hearth to here by the draught from the window when the door was opened. It's part of a letter. You can see the burnt remains of the other part in the corner of the fender. He probably lighted the cigarette with it, out of bravado. His last bravado. Read this. The superintendent read. Repeat that I realize how fond you are of me, but you have killed my affection for you, and I shall leave our home tomorrow. This is absolutely final. E. Dr. Austin Bond, having for the nth time satisfactorily demonstrated in his own unique, rapid way that police officers were a set of numbskulls, bade the superintendent a most courteous good evening, nodded amicably to the detective sergeant, and left in triumph. "I must get some morning and go back to the flat," said Emily Frantin. She was sitting one morning in the lobby of the Palace Hotel, Copenhagen. Lomax Harder had just called on her with an English newspaper containing an account of the inquest at which the jury had returned a verdict of suicide upon the body of her late husband. Her eyes filled with tears. "Time will put her right," thought Lomax Harder, tenderly watching her. "I was bound to do what I did, and I can keep it a secret forever." So that was Murder! By Arnold Bennett. So first let me tell you something about Arnold Bennett. So Arnold Bennett was born Enoch Arnold Bennett. I wonder why. I mean, I'm John Anthony, known as Tony, so, I can't complain about that. Anyway, Enoch Arnold Bennett was born on the 27th of May, 1867, in Hanley, Staffordshire. He was a prolific English novelist, playwright, journalist, and essayist. He grew up in the Potteries district of Staffordshire, my duck, an area that would later serve, they don't say it like that though, my duck. My hands didn't know that's Cornwall. I remember going there and being called Love and Duck by blokes, and I thought, this is funny. But it's just their way. He grew up in the Potteries district of Staffordshire, I said that, an area which would later serve as the backdrop for many of his most famous works. After working as a clerk in his father's legal practice, Bennett moved to London in 1889 to pursue a career in literature. I did that, but it didn't work out. He initially found success as a journalist, becoming assistant editor of the periodical Woman in 1894. That was going for donkeys. My mother used to read that back in the 70s. His first novel, A Man from the North, again, good title, was published in 1898, marking the beginning of his career as a novelist. His literary breakthrough came with the publication of Anna of the Five Towns. I think that's the Potteries of the Five Towns, aren't they? In 1902, followed by The Old Wives' Tale in 1908, both set in his native Potteries, as you just read on. These works established him as a leading figure in the realist tradition. Get a grip of that, realist tradition. And I want you to remember it, known for his detailed depictions of provincial life and keen observations of human nature. It's grim up north, Throughout his career, no, it's not. Throughout his career, Bennett was remarkably versatile, producing not only novels but plays, film scenarios, short stories, and non-fiction works. He was a notable literary critic and wrote extensively on the craft of writing. He knows how to write, to be fair. Despite his commercial success and popularity, Bennett often faced criticism from modernist writers who viewed his work as old-fashioned. Nevertheless, his influence remains significant. He died on 27th of March 1931 in London. He was only 63, same age as I am now. He died of typhoid, which he contracted during a visit to Paris in February of that year. He had treatment in a nursing home, but he passed away, sadly. So let's talk about this story, Murder. Anyway, shut up. So by Arnold Bennett. Well, you know that. So it was first published on the 1st of January 1927. And so it is, we were saying about him being a realist. This is not realist, is it? This is vaguely comic, to be honest. It's not wholly comic, but it's... you have the realist novels of grim life, or people having a cup of tea and walking to get a newspaper and stuff like that, and it's realist. This isn't like that. This is kind of stylized. It's almost comic. It's the difference between a photograph and a comic book illustration. Okay, it was written during the golden age of detective fiction. That's another thing to remember. But he plays with it because many of the conventions, such as you find in Dorothy L. Sayers, Agatha Christie, he subverts. But, Agatha Christie also did a bit of subverting on her own, so I'm sticking up for Dame Agatha there, who's my big pal. At first glance, Murder appears to be a straightforward crime narrative. However, Bennett quickly upends reader expectations by revealing both the murderer and his motivations at the outset. So this shifts it from a whodunit is it to a whodunit? Because we know why as well. So it's not even a whodunit. It's not a howdunit. It's not a whodunit. It's not a whodunit. And those are the main genres of detective fiction. You know, we want to know who done it. Why did they do it? If we're revealed who did it, we go, well, why did they do it? And sometimes writers hold that back. Is Gone Girl like that? Somebody will comment. I've just thought that thought now, so I haven't really given it any time. So, and the how done it sometimes, like the locked room mysteries. You know, this could have been, it could have been turned on its head. It could have been they found the body. Dr. Austin Bond, the detective, could have found the body, and they'd need to work out how it was committed. This is a very famous subgenre of detective fiction, the locked room. But it's not that, because although, you know, they don't know how the guy got, how the murderer came in and got out, but we do. So it's not even a locked room mystery. It is similar to the inverted detective story, you know. So the inverted detective story was another subgenre, and you know, it's associated with R. Austin Freeman, and in his collection, The Singing Bone, 1912. So this was out in time for Arnold Bennett to have read it. And how it does is this in an inverted detective story, instead of it being a whodunit, the crime, including the perpetrator and the modus operandi, is disclosed to the audience almost immediately. This creates a form of dramatic irony where the reader, I just need to link to that, where the reader knows. So I've said this many times, you know, but I don't know if you want to talk about it. So dramatic irony, there is in fiction, there is an imbalance between what the protagonist knows and what the listener knows. And this is really important. If you're writing, you have to be aware of this, even if it's kind of not, you're not, it's not the forefront of your mind. If you're doing it well, it will be up there, you know. So what I mean is, if look at Sherlock Holmes. So Sherlock knows a lot more than we do. That is mystery. Yeah. This is a guy called Robert Key, wrote about this in his book Story, which is a great book if you're interested in writing. He's mainly a screenwriter, but the story, you know, whether it's a graphic novel, whether it's an opera, whether it's a film or a novel, it's the same idea, or a piece of epic poetry recited by Homer. There is that imbalance between what the protagonist knows. So, and this is very true in Greek. Look at Oedipus Rex. You know, that is dramatic irony. So mystery is where, and if you've heard me say this before, forgive me, mystery is where the protagonist knows more than us. Example, Sherlock Holmes. He knows before we know. All right. The next thing is suspense, where we are advancing through the eyes of the protagonist, and a lot of kind of hard-boiled stuff is like this. So we are, you know, let's say with Sam Spade, he doesn't know, we don't know, yeah? And it's like, oh, what's around the corner? Neither of us know, you know, that's suspense. The third one is where we know more than the protagonist, and that's dramatic irony. And think of Oedipus Rex. We know he's married his mother and killed his father, but he doesn't. So in the inverted detective story, it can be done so that we are watching the detective and we actually know, but the detective doesn't. So that's dramatic irony. So that is the classic inverted detective story. This story, Murder, isn't even quite that, because it is a little bit at the end. The superintendent and Dr. Austin Bond, don't know. We know. I think that is used for comic effect in this story rather than it could be used for make us cry. You know, a lot of dramatic irony. We see the hero who we're invested in. We know what terrible fate is coming, and we're going no, no, no. But he doesn't know when he walks, or she, and they walk straight into it. But in this case, because of how it ends, we're like, yeah, whatever, what a clown. So it bears resemblance to the inverted detective story, but it isn't. All right. So let's say something else. Characters, his use of characters. This is very interesting, I think. And this is an accomplished author, and he knows what he's doing. And so from the very beginning, we set up two men. They're equivalent. He even uses this, and this is where the resemblance ends. So they're a similar age, they're a similar social class, they're walking in the same place. So far, so similar. And then he says, but they're different. And then he paints a picture of John Frantin, who is, Lomax Harder first, who's a refined, sympathetic figure. He's a poet. Arnold Bennett considers poets to be great men and women. He doesn't say women, he doesn't say men, but they're a good thing. Poets, they are amongst the elite, the moral elite of society. I think he's suggesting that. So he's a good egg from the very beginning, Lomax Harder, and he continues perhaps to be a good egg. And that's of course, the twist in the story. That's the nub of the story, isn't it? So it's not a whodunit or a whodunit or howdunit. It's a let's have a think about morality story. I haven't got a fancy. I don't know, why not do it? I don't know. Somebody come up with that. So and then we have John Frantin, who is portrayed as a tough customer, a boxer. He's physically of a less exalted kind. He's dark haired. He's rather than blonde haired. All these kind of things, and these are signifiers. These are tropes, if you like, that we do it all the time. All authors, you watch your next movie, your next TV series, and the moral status of the character is going to be signaled to you. Sometimes that's subverted. Sometimes you sold somebody as a bad guy and it turns out to be a good guy. But how do they sell you the bad guy? They do things like this. They have this description of and they a deluder of women. So that's the only mention of it. But from an early stage, John Frantin is portrayed to be an adulterer. So he isn't pure in his marriage. Okay. The next thing is when we get a bit more into it, the character, through their speech, and we have Frantin. He doesn't even. I think Bennett, he's very clear to say he would do it for her anyway, even if he wasn't enamored of her. It isn't because he wants to have hot sex with her, this man's wife, so he's going to kill him, because that would remove his moral purity. So he would do it just because he's a saint, although he's a murdering saint. I think that's a good name for a band, the Murdering Saints. Saint Murderers. I don't know. Anyway, so, and I think John Frantin, I enjoy doing that dialogue so much because Frantin is just despicable, isn't he? He's just utterly despicable. And so it's set up. We're going to have a murder. But the twist is that the murder is virtuous. Or is he? He believes he's virtuous. He thinks it's a righteous act, and he sets out why, because he's protecting the beloved sainted Emily from. And this is this guy's Frantin is a. I don't know if he says it's a wife beat. He's certainly controlling. He's certainly coercion and control. That's illegal in the UK. I was when I was working in safeguarding. Domestic abuse wasn't just considered physical abuse. It became illegal. The coercion and control became illegal as well. So that's the first part of the story, I think. It's related to the second part of the story. Almost we could have had that without the detectives. It could have cut that off. And I think it's very interesting that our man, Lomax Harder, even though he's convinced of the righteousness of his act, first of all, he's guilty. He feels guilty. But that's, again, crime and punishment. What is it about crime? Why don't we just go out and commit crimes? Is it because we're inherently virtuous people? And I think that's what Bennett is trying to say about Lomax Harder. He's inherently virtuous. Or is it that we don't want to be punished? When he's running, that's definitely on his mind. Even though he's convinced he's done a virtuous act, he's still frightened, and he still tries to set up an alibi because he's frightened of the consequences of his righteous act. That kind of raises another question, which is, I think, is there really in the second part of the story, which is to say that if the organs of society, of the state, the police, the court service, if they do not deliver justice, then do we take the law into our own hands? If the law will not protect us, do we take the law into our own hands? And this is a big debate, are you allowed to defend your own home? And this varies. There are people listening to this from all over the world, and the law on what you're allowed to do to defend your own home is very different in different places. In some cases, you can just take a machine gun out and shoot somebody who comes into your house. In other places, if you did that, you would be arrested for murder. Even if somebody comes into your house and you punch them right in the face, in some places, you would be punished for that. In other places, they would just think, well, no, that's fine. So I think this highlights the legal system, and it isn't because, yeah. So does the legal system protect Emily in 1920 odd from her vile husband? It doesn't. Yeah? Now, if it was 2027 and it did, would that then make Lomax Harder's act less virtuous? You will have a position on this yourself about whether you think Lomax Harder is a hero, or whether you think, no, he should be punished. He murdered somebody, he took somebody's life. It doesn't matter. It reminds me about, and this is massive, this is all utilitarianism versus Kantian deontology. So just in the thing, so utilitarianism just is like an Excel spreadsheet. You add up the virtue in the world and the virtue, and you subtract the badness, and then what you end with your action, you do a little calculation. Will it increase? Will it create more happiness or less happiness? If it creates happiness, it's okay to do it. Whereas Immanuel Kant says about this deontology, it's the intention that's important. It isn't anything like a calculation. Virtue is virtuous in essence, so it is one should not kill. Thou shalt not kill. End of. Doesn't matter. I mean, we've always broken that law in war and in this countries, and historically in this country we used to execute people. When the state would execute people. And so we have broken that commandment, but we would justify it and say, well, I know the commandment says, thou shalt not kill, but in this case, I'm sure God would agree with us, Gott strafe England, So, famously in the First World War, everybody's out there going, God's on our side, he wants you dead, Oh, no, he wants you dead. It's the same God. Now, you may say, there is no God. Fair enough, if you say that. That's another big debate, isn't it? We just touch on too many big debates. Let's rein it in a little bit. So the second part is it's doing a couple of things. It's doing what I said, which is it's questioning the difference between legality and justice. Legalism and justice, they're not the same thing. And clearly, Lomax Harder thinks that justice is really important and legality is the second runner. The other thing it's doing is, and then that issue about whether the organs of the state are effective. In this case, they're clearly not. And so we can talk about that. But I think the other thing that it's doing is we're seeing the police are incompetent. I mean, he thinks the murderer is this three-fingered charwoman, the superintendent. He's a bumbling fool, and Arnold Bennett is clear about that, And then and the other thing he's doing is playing with the genre, so we get Dr. Austin Bond. And in the Golden Age, we have these super intellectual detectives, Hercule Poirot, Miss Marple, but Peter Wimsey, Sherlock Holmes. There's a bunch of them. If you go through what we've done on the channel so far, there they come. And Dr. Austin Bond fits this mold, doesn't he? He's a doctor. Lots of them are doctors, and he's very, very clever. He's very arrogant, and he looks down on the police. These are all characteristics of the super sleuth who we usually in this genre trust to. The police usually don't come out of it very well. In modern novels, they do, As I said, I was just reading One of Us is Dead by Peter James, and that's a police procedural, and the police are actually pretty competent. So things changed in the 20s and 30s, and before they didn't think much of the police, I don't think. I don't know, but if we look at the stories, they don't trust them. And in this case, of course, this super sleuth, and they always wheedle their way in somehow. And Bennett's quite clear that the only, and Sherlock Holmes does similar things, and Hercule Poirot knows the big men at the Met, but Bennett's playing with this, that people draw on their these super sleuths draw on their snobby connections with people at the club to get their feet in the door, but he then mocks the superintendent's ridiculous and just incorrect solution to the crime, and then his own solution is even more ridiculous. He doesn't even think there is a crime, and his clincher is somehow this guy blew his brains out, and then somehow the revolver fell into his pocket. It's absurd. But so to wrap it up, this is a justifiable. I think he's portraying a justifiable murder. Bennett's clearly never condemns Harder. It doesn't fully absolve him, but I think certainly maybe me, I feel that Arnold Bennett's on the side of Harder, or else he would have been caught, and tried, I think. So it is better that a brute should die than the heavenly enchanting innocent person, Emily. And Emily, there is no question that she isn't innocent. She's a woman who's had a hard time, but this is not a novel that focuses on. If it was a realist novel, I think it would focus on the domestic abuse and her suffering. I think that's what it would do, but it isn't. It's playing with, and when I say playing, I don't mean necessarily toying. I think it's in a very entertaining way throwing ideas at us. I mean, there's lots to say about this story. The use of dialogue, pacing. Let's say something about its context. So, at the same time, we have he's contemporary with Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers. Perhaps provocatively, we may see this relatively minor story as a bridge between the puzzle-oriented Golden Age mysteries, locked rooms, super sleuths, and later more psychologically complex crime fiction. I think it's, where is it? I think there's an argument to be said for that, but I think it's a good story. It was a fun story. It was nicely written. I enjoyed narrating it, and there is a lot to think of. You will, in fact, there isn't a lot to think of, because you listening to this will already know how you feel about whether this is a justifiable murder or not. And whereas you may enjoy the ridiculousness of Dr. Austin Bond and the character portrayal, you if you feel it's justifiable, you will have felt some satisfaction in him blowing his brains out. And you're probably comfortable with that. I mean, it's not real, let's face it. So you don't really have to be too hard on yourself. Anyway, a good story, I thought. More coming soon. Please do remember, just to help me out, if you've enjoyed the story and my thoughts about it, could you share? Could you subscribe? Put the notifications on so that you'll get telt, as we say, when another story pops up. That I do another one. Okay. Have a lovely week.